Hey debaters, welcome to Rock On Debate, a one-clap speech and debate source for quick tips, hacks, resources, and other rockin' support to help inspire and assist debaters. I'm your host, Lyle Wiley, high school English teacher and speech and debate coach in Thermopolis, Wyoming. A new year is upon us, and with that new year, a new Lincoln Douglas resolution. Today, Matt Liu, the director of debate at the University of Wyoming, is here to orient us to this new resolution. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. Matt Liu has a master's degree in communication studies from Wake Forest University and over 20 years of experience in competitive debate. Before joining the University of Wyoming staff, he coached multiple national championships in college debate at the University of Minnesota, Wake Forest University, and Liberty University. He's also coached multiple national championships at the high school level while working for the Harker School, the New Trier, and Bronx Science. While in college, he won and was top speaker at the American Debate Association National Championship and was a quarterfinalist at the National Debate Tournament. Matt has some initial thoughts to share about the resolution, and I think they will prove helpful for coaches and debaters, so let's go ahead and get started thinking through the new resolution with some great work by Matt Liu.
Hello, folks. My name is Matt Liu, and I'm the Director of Debate at the University of Wyoming, and this is my topic analysis for the Lincoln Douglas January-February 2024 West Asia, North Africa military presence topic. If you're a reader and not a listener, you can check out a virtually identical analysis on Wyoming Debate Roundup.weebly.com, or just Google Wyoming Debate Roundup, or I think Lyle will probably put a link in the comments. All right, so without further ado, resolved. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. I want to offer a little bit of disclaimer that these are off-the-cuff reactions. I've had a lot of similar topics in the umpteen years that I've been doing debate, so I feel like I have a pretty good feeling for how to debate military presence. But I still think you should take my observations with a grain of salt, do the copious, in-depth research to further your own understanding of the region, key terms, and arguments, and get your own picture of what you want this resolution to look like for you. So I'm going to begin with quite a bit of definitional work before I jump into sort of F-ground, neg ground. And the first question is, what is the West Asia, North Africa region? And I think West Asia is probably a little bit of an unfamiliar term, or at least you might be more familiar with the term Middle East. The reason we are probably using the term West Asia in this resolution is because Middle East has fallen a little bit out of favor, particularly with many of the folks who live in the region referred to by that name. Not unanimously, but probably especially some scholars like the WANA Institute, West Asia North Africa Institute, which is based out of Jordan, argues that Middle East is an outdated term, that it's geographically ambiguous, and they prefer the term West Asia because the region is only east when considered from the perspective of Europe, right? You got to ask the question, east of what? And so you can find that take in plenty of other places too, and it leads to just a small preference for the term West Asia, which the geographic boundaries of are probably bigger and a little bit different. So what countries are included in West Asia, North Africa? I want to be clear that there's not a definitive list. There's no one right answer. There'll be large agreement on a list of core countries. Like everyone's going to agree Georgia and Saudi Arabia are in West Asia and Morocco and Algeria are in North Africa. But there's going to be quite a bit of debate about the margins. And some of those marginal countries are pretty important in terms of United States military presence. And so different sources are going to use different lists. And which countries are included or excluded is going to have to be a debate that you sometimes have. Not all the time. It's not always going to be relevant. But sometimes you're going to have a topicality debate about what's in West Asia or North Africa. So the United Nations Statistics Division lists 25 countries in Western Asia or Northern Africa. There's a little Western, Northern, slightly different terms, but I think forgivable. They include 18 countries in West Asia: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Cyprus, Georgia, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the State of Palestine, the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, and 7 in North Africa: Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, Western Sahara. Again, if you're a reader and not a listener, you can find that list on Wyoming Debate Roundup. The most common definitions of North Africa, including that of the African Union, pretty good source, use the same list except they exclude Sudan. North Africa also includes probably also includes several minor Spanish, British, and Italian territories, as well as Malta, some of the stuff in the southern Mediterranean. There's pretty solid agreement on North Africa. West Asia is much more contested. A lot of sources, including the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a pretty well-respected international organization, include 15 countries: Bahrain, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, the UAE, and Yemen. I know I'm speeding through these lists, but I'm going to focus on the differences at a slower pace, and I don't think the full list is something I need to spend too much time on. So there are others. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization includes Armenia and Azerbaijan, but excludes Israel and Turkey. So you get a little more and a little less. The UNSD excludes Iran and includes Turkey, Georgia, and Cyprus. I'm sitting on these because I think these are pretty important countries. So that UNIDO definition that excludes Israel and Turkey, that's pretty wacky. It's an outlier definition, and I think most definitions are going to include Israel and Turkey. But if you wanted to put a little weird T argument against an affirmative that talks a bunch about Israel or a bunch about Turkey, you could use the UNIDO definition to say that those countries aren't in West Asia. So affirmative contentions about them are irrelevant. There aren't many definitions of WANA as a whole, right? There's plenty of definitions of what West Asia includes and plenty of definitions of what North Africa includes, but there aren't very many lists of WANA as a whole. If you're bouncing around Wikipedia, you're going to find this, weird and agricultural think tank or random agricultural think tank, ICARTA. They list 27 countries in WANA: Afghanistan, Algeria, Bahrain, Djibouti, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gaza, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. I feel like I'm singing an Animaniacs song. But there are some notable things about that definition. ICARTA includes Afghanistan, Djibouti, and Pakistan, which not many other lists do. Why am I focusing on those three? Well, let's hyper fixate on Djibouti for a second. It's a country in probably the Horn of Africa, right? So weird to call it North Africa. And it's got Camp Lemonnier, the only U.S. military base in Africa. And so the list that includes Djibouti, that includes the country that is the only U.S. military base in Africa. That's pretty important. And so if you like debating at the margins of the topic, then you might be eyeballing those larger lists. If you like debating bad T arguments, you might be looking at the UNIDO definition that excludes countries like Turkey and Israel. So there's agreement on a major set of core countries, but there's some very interesting marginal inclusions and exclusions that will be worth preparing arguments and debates over. No list is automatically right. When it matters, emphasis on when it matters, you've got to debate the exclusions and inclusions. Now, should you devote time in round to reading a definition of what countries WANA includes in every round? No, I think that would be a catastrophic waste of time, particularly on the affirmative. You should select moments where it matters. Is the affirmative about Djibouti? You should make an argument that Djibouti is not in North Africa. That matters. It's worth spending the time to talk about not just definitions, but why your definition that excludes Djibouti is preferable. Okay, so what's military presence mean? On the last topic where I coached that had the phrase military presence, the most popular definition by far was that military presence means U.S. bases. If you want some articles, you can go to the hard copy, the Wyoming Debate Roundup stuff that links to articles like James Muirnick's definition that U.S. military presence is a U.S. military base. But, and there are other definitions too, but that bases one probably won't work out great on this topic, because I believe any good definition of North Africa, well, none of those countries have a military base. The only U.S. military base in Africa is Camp Lemonnier. It's in Djibouti, and it's almost certainly not North Africa. Outlier definitions notwithstanding. But I don't think that means there's no North Africa part of the topic. That would be very silly. It just means that the old definition of military presence equals military base is perhaps undesirable on this topic. At least it's undesirable for the North Africa portion. I think there's a whole separate debate about whether or not military presence means one thing in Africa and a different thing in West Asia. This guy, Michael O'Hanlon, is like the head of foreign policy at the Brookings Institute. He actually makes an argument that we should use different definitions for Africa because military presence looks so different there. And he's like actually advances an argument for having different definitions of that phrase in different places. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But if it's not bases, what is military presence? Could be a lot of different things. Could be smaller infrastructures that house U.S. troops. And the literature, I often see these referred to as lily pads or cooperative security locations, CSLs. And they're just like smaller than bases. Like a base is a pretty big deal. And so a CSL might have troop numbers literally in the single digits or sometimes in the low hundreds. A lot of our military presence in Africa is drones. So maybe drone infrastructure is military presence. I actually think that's like quite a good definition for North Africa because a lot of what we're doing is just droning Al-Shabaab and other groups that we call terrorists. We don't have a lot of boots on the ground, though. And even in countries like Egypt and Israel, where we have big military relationships, we don't have a lot of boots on the ground. And so maybe military presence include things like arms sales, military aid, training, counterterrorism operations, joint military exercises. Those are things that you could argue are military presence, and it opens up a lot of different ways to talk about Israel and Egypt. But if those are military presence, this topic is huge, right? If it's bases, this topic is tiny. If it's arms sales, military aid, training, counterterrorism, joint military exercises, this topic is huge. Maybe that's fine. In fact, net ground is really good. So like maybe that's fine. And so you can sort of scour around and find different definitions that are very limiting, like Daniel Gore argues that military presence needs to be nearly continuous, highly visible. I think that's a useful limiter because if military presence is continuous, then it isn't some troops that we have sent in but aren't permanently stationed in a place. I already mentioned the O'Hanlon evidence. There's definitely evidence that says military presence is all those things I talked about, like arms transfers, arms sales, training. The ITAR program in Egypt is a huge deal. So what countries in WANA have U.S. military presence? That is a $1 million question, right? Because it combines the two terms that matter, West Asia, North Africa, and military presence, and only things at the intersection matter. A country in West Asia that doesn't have U.S. military presence isn't really part of the topic. So what's the answer? Bahrain has the 5th fleet. Huge. Turkey has U.S. nuclear weapons. Huge deal. The majority of our troops in the region are in Kuwait and Qatar, and there are a non-insignificant number in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. We've got smaller numbers in Syria and Iraq, but maybe they're even more important because they're oriented around specific missions and operations. They're like kind of doing more stuff. We've got an enormous military relationship with Israel. That's obvious. But like I said, troops on the ground aren't a huge portion of it. We do a bunch of military aid, arms sales. We have a bunch of training exercises, joint military exercises, yada, yada. But are those things military presence? That would be AFGround. Or are they less than presence? And that's not just not AFGround. That's what we call an alt cause. That's neg ground, right? Because if the AF says our military presence in Israel is bad and we should reduce it, but arms sales and aid aren't military presence, then like most of our military relationship, broader term than presence, stays intact with Israel. The AF can't topically affect most of the military relationship. So that definition debate, if somebody wants to talk about Israel, that's super important because if that stuff's not military presence, it's an alt cause. It's a reason the AF doesn't solve because military relationship stays intact. So, all right, this is the end of the definitions debate. What WANA countries have military presence? Answering that requires us to agree on what West Asia is, what North Africa is, and what military presence is. And if somebody tells you they've got the answers to all of those questions, you should not believe them because those are things that are subject to debate. But that's a good thing. Topicality, or T debates, are fun. And on this topic, they could really matter. U.S. has nuclear weapons in Turkey. Is Turkey West Asia? Are nukes military presence? The answers to those questions have huge implications for the topic. Also, they're yes and almost certainly yes. Okay, so let's real quick talk about one more thing before we get into AF ground, neg ground. And that is the phrase substantially reduce and the difference between whole res debates and subsets. Substantially reduce is a pretty common phrase in policy resolutions, but maybe it's more novel for Lincoln Douglas. And it might open up room for some quirks that are worth talking about. Most obviously, it means the AF doesn't need to defend a holistic or totalizing elimination of US military presence in WANA. If the neg says military presence in Israel is good, they have an Israel contention, I think the AF could just agree. The AF could just be like, you know what? We don't need to argue with this because we can substantially reduce military presence, and that could leave US military presence in Israel, and we could still substantially reduce US military presence in West Asia, North Africa. All this means is like if the Israel military presence isn't a substantial portion of our WANA military presence, then you've met the burden of the resolution. Let's like be very, very clear here. The resolution does not say eliminate all military presence in West Asia, North Africa. It says substantially reduce. And the implication here is that the negative is going to have a really tough time with country-specific offense. And so if you have like a Bahrain contention, a Turkey contention, an Israel contention, on the neg, I just think the AF can no link and say, hey, the burden of this resolution is saying that we need to substantially reduce military presence. Military presence can still be in Turkey, and we've still defended substantially reducing it across the region as a whole. Now, if that sounds scary, it shouldn't, because this topic is cracked for the negative. And so losing that is like not that big of a deal. But it has interesting implications for the AF. It could arguably open the door for subset AFs to rear their head in Wyoming. What do I mean by subset AFs? I mean AFs that explicitly defend reducing military presence in just one or a few countries. Countries like Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey jump out to me as places that could be focal points for subset AFs. Bahrain is the Fifth Fleet. We have nuclear sharing with Turkey. Those countries could be AFs by themselves. You could defend just reducing military presence in Turkey. And an argument for that is that a one-size-fits-all approach to West Asia and North Africa is wrong-headed. U.S. military presence in Tunisia is not the same as U.S. military presence in Israel. And it would be foolhardy to treat them as the same. No good policymaker would treat Morocco the same as Iraq, and I'd argue that no good philosopher would either. Okay, I would welcome the introduction of subset AFs into Wyoming LD with open arms, but I will offer significant cautions to any debater that tries to brave this path. On the one hand, the resolution explicitly allows for a less than total reduction of U.S. military presence in WANA. It's a persuasive point to lay judges, and progressive judges probably already amenable to hearing subset AFs. I like the way subset AFs would open the topic. I think it's net good because this topic is too good for the negative. The AF needs more tools. That is a very good argument to make in a debate over whether or not subset AFs are legitimate. The topic would still be reasonably limited because you still have to win that what you defend reducing is a substantial military presence in WANA. The Fifth Fleet by itself in Bahrain is definitely substantial. The 10 soldiers in Algeria, I made the number up, I don't know, maybe 0, are definitely not. What could be more substantial than the nuclear weapons the US houses in Turkey? I think the fact that there's a little bit of gray area is a feature, not a bug. Topicality debates over what should be included are educational and they're exciting. I think they're fun. However, I said all this is good for lay judges, right? Who you just need to make smart arguments in front of. Progressive judges, totally willing to hear all this. But there are many traditional judges in Wyoming. The difference between what I would call a traditional judge and a lay judge is that a traditional judge has thoughts and opinions, deeply felt opinions about what Lincoln Douglas should be. And those folks, some of those folks, might reject subset AFs on face, or at least create a very uphill burden if you were to try and argue that it was legitimate or good. And so you should be careful, and you should remember that judge adaptation trumps everything else. Okay, fun stuff. AF ground. I'm going to talk about whole res AFs first, There's 4 big arguments I'm going to talk about first, but I'm going to be careful here. These are not the arguments I think are the best. These are the arguments I think are going to be the most common. I've got some major issues with how strategic these whole res Fs are. Remember, I've said the F needs subset Fs. And so this is not the F ground I think is the winner, not first, but I think is going to be the most common. Okay, the first is blowback. U.S. military presence generates anger and resentment. You could say that's bad for alliances. You could say it causes conflict, countries like Iran, or you could say it creates motivation for terrorists to attack us. The second is escalation. Maybe you could call this draw-in. And it's the argument that U.S. military presence overseas makes it likely that the U.S. will be drawn into a foreign conflict. In some places where we have U.S. troops, we intentionally place them as a tripwire, meaning that if U.S. troops are attacked, the U.S. will feel compelled to retaliate. It's kind of political, right? We put our troops there so that if there's an attack in that country and our troops die, that the American blood being shed will create a political necessity to retaliate and get involved. But maybe that's a really bad idea. Many people will argue that America shouldn't be the world's police. I bet we hear that phrase so much, too much. One time is too much. Because it makes conflict more likely and great power escalation possible. The U.S. can't get into a war in West Asia if we aren't in West Asia. That's a better line. Of course, you'll need to win that conflict is more likely in WANA than other places. Otherwise, U.S. military presence in the Horn of Africa or East Asia are alt causes. Let's sit on that for one more second. To win one of these arcs about escalation, you have to win conflicts more likely in West Asia. Otherwise, why wouldn't our troop presence in East Asia, significantly larger and closer to countries like China, why wouldn't that cause a conflict just as easily? Okay, the next argument is resource trade-off. I kind of think this one will be common. It's the argument that the resources we use overseas will be better spent at home. And people will say that rather than spending so much money having an overseas military presence, we should use those resources on our own citizens. I don't know, maybe they'll be a little vague about what that would mean, but it could mean things like healthcare, education, infrastructure. And then finally, going kind of the opposite direction, there's an imperialism argument that U.S. military presence is modern-day imperialism, and it's certainly true that U.S. power projection would be substantially weakened if our overseas military presence were curtailed. And related to this, on previous military presence topics, I've definitely heard the argument that U.S. military presence results in sexual violence that's committed by our troops. The link on these arguments is pretty strong. But I think all 4 of these arguments suffer from a number of huge strategic weaknesses. And chief among them is shift. My question is, what happens after we reduce our WANA military presence? The soldiers don't simply disappear. They go somewhere else. Where is probably a normal means debate. But I'd say Guam is a very likely candidate. It has the capacity to house more U.S. military presence. And we have a huge motive to put more troops there, containing China. And if we just move our troops somewhere else for a different military objective, doesn't it cause almost all, if not all, of those impacts? It's not to say that these arguments, blowback, escalation, resource trade-off, imperialism, it's not to say that they're non-starters, but they are going to struggle against arguments like shift and a few other things I'll mention later. They're going to struggle a lot more than contentions that get more specific. And so here's my push. The more specific your contentions are, the harder they are to refute. Arguments that all military presence is bad is not the optimal defense of why WANA military presence is bad. And I think here we can maybe arrive at a happy middle ground between whole res AFs and subsets AFs. Because an AF that defends a substantial reduction of military presence across all of WANA, but as contentions that are specific to particular countries, may capture some benefits of both worlds. Okay, so it can't reduce neg link ground like a subsets AF, right? A subsets AF that's just about Bahrain can dodge negative contentions, I'm just going to call them DAs, can dodge DAs, disads, like it's its job. But even with a whole res AF, if it has more specific contentions, it's still going to be very insulated against arguments like shift. If you read a Fifth Fleet bad argument that is about like why having the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain is bad, so there's cards that it's like it's too vulnerable in Bahrain. moving it somewhere else is like the point, not a negative argument. If you've got an argument that nuclear sharing in Turkey is bad, well, those wouldn't go to Guam. We'd probably bring those back home. And so I think those can be very, very strong arguments. The more specific your contentions are, the better. Okay. One last ground thing is the Asia pivot. President Obama wanted to move a substantial portion of our military presence out of what he called the Middle East and into East Asia to bolster our Asian alliances and to better contain China. Many people believe the Asia pivot failed because we ultimately stayed too much in Middle Eastern countries. Like we ultimately didn't have the political will to make a substantial withdrawal of our military presence from the Middle East or West Asia. I think clever AF teams could explore saying that reducing military presence in WANA is the right move because it results in increasing military presence in East Asia. Like this is Guam shift good, and it deletes shift as a negative argument because it's an argument that shift is good. So I think that's clever. I think it could be a good argument. The literature might be a little bit dated because the Asia pivot was a much bigger deal during the Obama administration, but I think you'd find some recent articles about it. Okay. Negative ground. On almost any foreign policy topic, the first two words that you should think of are deterrence and assurance. Deterrence and assurance. In debate terms, deterrence is about how U.S. power stops bad actors from doing bad things, how it deters our rivals and adversaries. Reducing U.S. military presence could remove impediments from our adversaries from taking aggressive military action, or it could be a signal of weakness that encourages adversarial action regardless of the military reality. So who are our adversaries in WANA? I think in West Asia, the obvious answer is Iran. Now, I don't think prolif is a good place to start, right? Like people want to talk about Iran getting nukes. I think that's kind of disconnected from the question of U.S. military presence. But our military presence might deter other forms of Iranian aggression or Iran conflicts. And so like a lot of times debaters like one track mind, they're like Iran, prolif. That's the only thing there is to talk about. It's like, they got like some things going on there that are more than that. And like an Iran-Saudi conflict, they're like not friends, is like maybe a huge deal. Or just like other arguments about why Iranian aggression might escalate if the U.S. wasn't there to contain them. I do think, though, that assurance is a stronger argument. Assurance is about the signal we send to our allies. And so the neg-arg here is that U.S. military presence assures our allies that we will protect them, and thus they don't need to take aggressive actions to protect themselves. You could think of this as an alliances DA, but I think it'll be better with specific impacts. So an example would be arguing that Western Asia military presence prevents Saudi Arabia from proliferating, that they fear the Iranian bomb that's like inevitable and they already have a latent capability. And in the absence of a credible U.S. military presence to protect them, Saudi Arabia would seek their own bomb to counter a potential Iranian threat. There's like good literature about this. And there's like some arguments about like a secret deal between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, where Pakistan would help Saudi Arabia develop a nuclear weapon if they were so inclined. Another big U.S. ally in the region, Israel. A reduction in our military presence in West Asia, and I want to be clear, like not even in Israel, but just like around Israel, could definitely disrupt the U.S.-Israel relationship. And there's a lot of different ways you could say that that is important. I think one of the best and most scary is that if Israel believed we lack the will or capability to protect them, they might preemptively strike Iranian nuclear facilities, right? If Israel was like, ooh, the United States withdrawing from the region, that probably means they can't protect us. And even if they could, like maybe they won't because they're withdrawing, like not a good signal. And Iran, scary, pretty close to getting nukes. Maybe we should bomb them before they do. There's a lot of people that think that's a real bad idea. Israel bombing Iranian nuclear facilities could be the start of some real bad war. Okay, those are good arguments, but there's a lot more. I've already talked about shift as a solvency deficit, but it could just be a disadvantage. I know. I should say neg contention, but it's all the same. I'm going to say disadvantage. So just like you can argue that the Asia pivot is good, you can argue it's bad. Perhaps a reduction in U.S. military presence in WANA results in increased presence in East Asia because we want to contain China, but maybe that aggravates China, stokes U.S.-China tension, maybe it even causes a war. Okay, and I know I'm talking a lot about war, and isn't that policy debate and not LD as an LD about philosophy? It is a foreign policy topic about our military presence, and like y'all. the point of our military presence is to deter war. We're talking about U.S. troops, and we're talking about the reasons we put them in certain places. And I think it's a little bit silly to think that the National Security Council is not thinking about the potential for conflict when they make decisions about where to house U.S. troops. So I know LD is afraid of being like policy, but I don't think we can be war phobic on a topic about where we put our military presence. Okay, little diatribe aside. Another excellent argument is fill-in. Countries like Qatar don't accept thousands of U.S. troops on their soil because they ideologically agree with what the U.S. wants to accomplish with those troops. They do it because they reap economic and geopolitical benefits from a foreign military presence. If the U.S. reduced its presence, you can bet Russia and China would be rushing to fill in. And I think that's a really solid solvency takeout to whole res advantages. But it's also a potential DA about increasing Russian-Chinese influence in the region being dangerous. Okay. Those are a lot of big arguments. I'm gonna jet through some smaller ones because you've been with me for a while. So counterterrorism, huge negative argument, especially since that's the mission that most U.S. troops and or military presence in WANA are committed to. Then it can also make arguments about energy, maritime security, sea lanes, and trade routes, right? Like you don't want to be like, we're there for the oil and that's good. But you can say, I mean, you could, honestly, like I wouldn't mind. But if you want to sound a little bit more above board, you could say that the U.S. military presence secures maritime security on major choke points like the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz. And that doesn't just benefit the United States. Free trade benefits the whole world. U.S. hegemony and power projection is another core negative argument. Our bases in West Asia allow us military access to other critical parts of the world, and they're definitely essential to project U.S. power globally. You could make arguments about the humanitarian missions our military engages in, like disaster relief. You might have a little bit of a tough time like winning the so what question, given the sort of like stakes of the other issues related to military presence, but it's not small ball, it matters. You could say that our WANA missions are also NATO missions, and that reducing our military presence in WANA undermines NATO cohesion. Okay, maybe that's a lot, but I'm just scratching the surface. There's plenty of more arguments to develop on both sides. We haven't even dipped our toes into more progressive argumentation, but that's certainly more than enough for now. So good luck on the January-February 2024 West Asia, North Africa military presence topic. I am excited to see what you all come up with.
Hey, thanks so much to Matt Liu for his thoughts on the new LD topic. Matt recorded these thoughts from his blog entry on the Wyoming Debate Roundup page, and I'll be sure to link to this post in our show notes. You should totally check out the blog. It's full of great debate resources. It's time for some shout-outs. Thank you to everyone who is a patron of One Clap Speech and Debate. Your kind gifts help me keep this show going. Special thanks to our patrons, Terry, Tina, Brenda, Aaron T, Melissa, Marcus, Laura, Londi, Ashley S., Joel, Matt, Alan, Ashley M., Aaron, Izzy, and Rick. This year, maybe consider supporting One Clap Speech and Debate by checking out our Patreon page. You can partner with me on this journey for as little as $1 a month and stop patronage at any time. If you have an idea or a request for Rock on Debate, shoot me an email at lylewiley@gmail.com or reach out on the One Clap Speech and Debate website or social media linked in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening to One Clap Speech and Debate. Remember, your voice matters. I'll catch you next time.